the flute is an ellipse. There are V-shaped flutes, and there are U-shaped flutes. So this is an elliptical fluted gouge, and this is a U-shape. That's what the U-shape looks like. So we got the elliptical U-shape. I tend to not use a V-fluted bowl gouge. It's harder to get the grind that I like on the gouge. This is another spindle rough and gouge. It's a little bit shorter, or a little bit smaller. This is a parting tool. In general, this is a parting tool that I personally wouldn't use. The diamond shaped, so there are parting tools that are flat, and there are parting tools that are diamond shaped. The challenge with the diamond shaped parting tools is they don't make room for themselves. Where if you just have a straight skinny parting tool, it makes room for itself as it's cutting. The diamond shaped tools don't. They have this taper that you end up burning and burnishing the wood actually in parts of it, and it's hard to sharpen it in a way that you can make room for yourself, because the top of the gouge is of the tool is skinnier than the middle point, so the cutting edge is leaving a skinnier hole than the tool's trying to fit through. So I tend to use, this is a makeshift parting tool that I made out of a really cheap chisel that I would only use for small pieces, because again, I don't have, like, this is not the right kind of tang for the job that it's doing. So I would only use this if I can make sure that only that much of the tool is sticking out. Otherwise, it's gonna break. Also, the steel that this is made out of is different than what generally turning tools tend to be made out of. Turning tools tend to be a little bit harder steel, because I mean you're literally turning through miles of wood between sharpening. So the sharpened edge doesn't really last that long. Other tools that you'll find if you go to a store and are looking for tools, you'll see a lot of these kind of things. Woodpecker brand makes a lot of them. There's also Easy Wood Tools. These are carbide inserts, and these are scrapers. All of the carbide tools are scrapers, and they only function as scrapers. Sometimes they will be, you'll have things that are labeled as negative rake scrapers, because in the wood turning world, negative rake scrapers are a really good thing, but they will call them negative rake scrapers without actually being a negative rake scraper. So this was branded as a negative rake scraper. There is no negative rake to the scraper. So when we're talking about negative rake, you bring out the skew, and this would be a negative rake scraper. I'm presenting the tool to the wood this way. The bevel is angled down away from the wood, whereas if it were angled up this way, it'd be positive rake. This has no rake. This scraper has no rake. So this is just presented flat. Generally, you want a negative rake scraper, because the scraper's job is to cut with the burr of the tool, and it'll last longer if you've got that negative rake, and you're much less likely to catch the grain. And so if you imagine I'm pointing this up, if I'm over exaggerating a positive rake and I'm coming up here, that's going to really want to catch into and dive into the wood here. Whereas if, and over exaggerating the negative rake, this is just able to roll, where that's just going to catch. And any imperfection, this is dramatic, but there are micro cracks in the wood that the blade's going to want to fall into, which will cause things to fly off the lathe, which you don't want. So scrapers, spindle gouge, bowl gouge, parting tool. There are folks who are really into using the skew. The skew chisel has its uses. I use the skew chisel as a scraper often. The challenge with using the skew chisel as a scraper is that the skew chisels tend to be a lot softer metal than what you would want out of a scraper. Generally, if you've got a dedicated scraper, you're going to want it to be like 10V steel, 10% vanadium steel or harder, so that the burr lasts longer. With 10V steel, the edge on the scraper can last up to a minute. If I were to use this as a scraper, which I usually do, you're going to get like 15-20 seconds out of it before you need to go back and resharpen. Before you should go back and resharpen. People don't necessarily sharpen that much. Usually when I'm turning, I'll keep my grinder running while the lathe is running, because I'll make a couple of cuts, go back to and touch up the blade real quick, make a couple more cuts, touch up the blade again. So my teacher does not use skew chisels. She is fond of saying that she uses skew chisels to sharpen pencils and open paint cans. But people who are good with a skew chisel can do a lot of really cool things, and there's a lot of beading that can happen with the skew chisel, as beading and coves. You can do a lot with it as long as you, like anything, the tool that you practice with is going to be the tool that you get good at. I pretty much do everything with a bowl gouge, but that's how my teacher taught me to do everything with a bowl gouge. So take that for what it is. Find a tool that you like and practice with it. So the tool rest. We want to make sure that our tool rest is appropriate for the job that we're doing. Ultimately, the thing that we care about is the angle that the tool rest is approaching the piece and the height that the tool rest is approaching the piece. The correct height for the tool rest depends on the tool that you're using. If I'm using the spindle rough and gouge, it's going to be a little bit different than if I'm using one of these scrapers. But what I want is for the blade of the tool, whatever the entry point of the tool is, to be at or very slightly above center. I can do that by, I can check that. Yes, I could check that on the piece, but easier way to check that is if this is where I want to be holding my tool, then I can see where the actual center line is on the lathe if I'm looking at my live centers. So this tool rest is a little bit high if this were how I wanted to present the tool. Otherwise, so if I wanted to leave it here, I'd have to bring my tool up here, and as we were talking about earlier, this is not the way that the spindle rough and gouge wants to be presented to the wood. So whereas these guys have there's a lot of, they've got a lot of rise, they've got a lot of width here, so the tool rest is generally going to be lower on this than it will on the bowl gouge, where the bowl gouge is going to be cutting right there. This is going to be cutting a little bit higher up, and so you just adjust based on your tool. And the angle is about what you're able to present your tool to. So here, this is a pretty good position here. I wish that this was interested in turning on. But this I'd be able to present at a proper angle. If anything, you want that to be able to drop the handle slightly below center. You don't want to ever be in a position where you're having to raise the handle up. If you have to raise the handle up that means that you're actually dipping the blade of your tool down in between the tool rest and the lathe, and this is spinning really, really fast, and it's going to want to catch here and bring your tool over. Even though there's only a tiny little bit of an edge here, there's a lot of torque coming from here that it will be able to force the tool over. So you can counteract that with longer handles, but the best way is to make sure that you don't dip below parallel. Speed. As fast as is safe. And yes, you can go with a general rule of the diameter of your piece times the RPMs needs to be within 6,000 and 9,000. So if I've got a 2-inch piece, 3,000 RPMs is still going to be pretty safe. So if I've got a 8-inch piece or a 10-inch piece, I definitely don't want to be, spinning it at 3,000 RPMs. So if you approach the lathe, or another really good, it's a totally subjective thing, but another good metric is the whoa factor, which is if I'm here and I'm approaching this, I don't really get a sense of like, whew, that's too much. It's a small cylinder. The edges are, so the smaller the diameter, the faster it's going to have to rotate in order to get a smooth cut. If I were to do that same thing, I won't, with this. So that was what, 26 RPMs? About?
2,600?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, 2,600. Something about speed is you should always start the lathe at 0. So if I turn it on, it doesn't do anything. And then I can slowly dial it in. That feels okay. To me, that feels a little slow. Now we're almost approaching it turned on and be whoa. That's a little scary. I would be okay with that now that it's not rattling and shaking anymore, but I would also put on a face shield for that. Because it's roughing, big chips are flying off, and they're flying off quickly. You'll also find the resonant frequency of the lathe by playing with the speed dial. You'll notice it's rattling more at the slower speed than it was at this faster speed, because this is one of the frequencies that the lathe itself wants to vibrate at. If I turn it up a little bit and get past that point, it smooths. Well, so that got a lot more vibrating. But if I go past that, maybe not. So this piece is just too off balanced. So I would want to turn it down to where we kind of got rid of. So that's a little bit smoother. It likes that. Everybody feel the difference in the vibrating that's happening. But even with a balanced piece, you can end up finding the frequency that the lathe itself wants to be vibrating at, and it'll usually be at multiples of whatever. If it's vibrating at 200 RPMs, then it's probably also going to vibrate a lot at 400 RPMs, and it's probably also going to vibrate a lot at 800 RPMs, just because that's how frequencies work. So if it's doing a lot of wobbling, you can play with this. You can either go faster or slower. You can go faster, and it'll start to smooth out, unless it's a really unbalanced piece. If it's an unbalanced piece, then if you go faster, it's just going to vibrate faster. Stance. So stance is referring to how we're positioning our body. Mostly, we don't want to be doing a ton of moving from here. That the moving that we're going to be doing is actually moving our whole body, and that's going to be mostly coming from our stance. If I'm going straight in to a piece, there's my chisel. And this is where I have to kind of turn away from you in order to do it properly. But if I'm going straight into a piece, my left foot's going to be forward. And I'm doing this from the perspective of somebody who would be turning with their right hand doing all of the work, and their left hand just holding the tool to the piece. Even though I'm a lefty, if the lathe is set up this way, most of the time we're going to want to be cutting into the drive center, so my right hand's going to be doing a lot of the work. This particular lathe could be set up, I can actually move the headstock, and I can flip it around the other way if I wanted to. But I don't recommend being a lefty woodturner. Just learn how to use your right hand. So my left hand's holding the tool down, which I'll get into in the technique section. But as far as stance goes, if I'm going straight in, my left foot is forward, and I'm just leaning forward with my body. If I'm roughing or moving parallel to the bed, my feet are set up so that they're parallel, and I'm not moving my arms, I'm moving my body. So I'm kind of on the balls of my feet. And moving my whole body rather than just moving my arms. And that's also gonna allow for a little bit more control, especially when you're trying to make sure that you've got the same diameter all the way down the piece. And if I'm rounding things, then the right foot's forward. So, or doing codes. So if I'm coming this way, my right foot's going to be forward because I want to kind of be out of the way of the tool. And then if I want to round that off, shift around this way. Same thing. If I want that to be a rounded bead, and I'm able to kind of pivot the whole way. And like that, my foot motion is I'm kind of swinging my butt all the way around, rather than trying to just do all of the work with my arms. The more that you're doing with your legs, your legs tend to, your legs and hips tend to be able to last a little bit longer than moving your arms around. And then technique. For technique, it's where, yes, all of this is about technique, but in the kind of section as far as the fundamentals go, when we're talking about technique, we're mostly talking about where your hands are. We're gonna move this over a little bit so that we can see. So, as I said a couple of times, your left hand, or the hand that's up at the tool, or up towards the blade, really isn't doing anything. Its only job is to prevent the the blade from skipping down the tool rest where, nope, wrong way. If I don't have anything there, it wants to slide down the rest. You know, depending on how I have it angled. If I had it angled this way, it wants to skip that way. And if you're getting that really loud sound, it's because the tool wasn't on the tool rest when you approached it. And that can happen actually a lot with the skew, is that somebody will be approaching the piece with this edge up a little bit, and this is actually the edge that hits, and it slams the tool down into the tool rest. Just makes a scary sound. Probably didn't end up having anything scary actually happen, other than it was a loud sound of the metal slamming into the metal. But your left hand is only acting as a doorstop to enter the cut, so that this can't slide down the tool rest. And then that's all your left thumb is doing, and then your other fingers are just pulling straight down. Not pulling into the piece. Your thumb is not pushing into the piece. Your left hand is just a doorstop and pulling straight down into the tool rest, preventing vibrations and keeping everything steady. Your right hand is doing all of the work. Your right hand and your hips and knees. But you should really only have like 2 pounds of pressure coming from your back hands. And again, as I mentioned briefly before, the tool is going to cut in the direction that your bevels cut. So an example of that, I'll kind of go back here again, and I'll switch it and do it the other way so that you can see. But using my thumb as a doorstop here, my other fingers are coming around for entering the piece, and I'm just pulling straight down, and then I'm entering the piece with just a little bit of pressure from my left hand. Once I've entered the piece, I can open up the flute, and my left hand isn't doing anything. Same thing if I'm doing roughing with bowl turning, or doing a lot, you know. I really wish that other piece was. Oh, that's too broken. You know, I can take a lot of material off with very little effort if I'm just using my right hand. If y'all want to stand up and back up that way, there's going to be chips flying. So again, I'm just pulling straight down here, and this is bowl. This is oriented as a bowl, so I'm cutting this way to cut into the longer. And you know, that was cutting about ½ an inch of material, and getting a pretty smooth cut here as well. Even though, you know, there are a couple of places where it chipped out, but that's kind of how things are going to happen when you're turning a piece end over end like that. Blew out a little bit at, like in the same way that you'd blow out on if you were running a block plane along the end grain of a piece, that it blew out the same way here. But using this technique, what can happen if you're not doing it this way is that you'll see a lot of folks who are kind of really muscling this, and they're doing everything by pulling and changing the angle, I'll turn this way. If I'm controlling it with my right hand, I'm changing the way that the blade is presented to the piece, which is going to change the way that it's cutting, and depending on the tool, change what's needed from the twist here, which is it's a lot more complicated to do than just pushing straight into the piece with your backhand. So again, I can pretty much take as much material as my flute allows for. So what happened there was, as I was getting towards the end of the piece, I was actually coming in too far. I came in past the wing of the blade, so I actually was taking off too much. My tool was too deep into the wood as I was over here. So we had some of that blowout. But I still have a nice surface finish here that would just require a little bit of sanding in order to do some kind of final cleanup. Yeah.
Doesn't that end piece get hot? Your hand? Why isn't it getting hot?
Your left hand.
It is. So I actually don't want to hold on to this for like that was a little much. Yes, it's going to get hot. It's going to get hot the more pressure that you're putting on it. So if you take shallower cuts, it won't get as hot. And if you have a sharp tool, it won't get as hot. So that's another reason for sharpening frequently, is reducing the amount of friction that you're dealing with in heating up the tool. But yes, it does get hot. If you find that the tool or the shavings coming off of the tool are uncomfortably hot and not just warm, then it's time to resharpen. That's one way of knowing that it's time to resharpen. Another way is if you're not getting, I'm even though I'm still not fully round, I'm still getting some curls. If it were just chips coming off, again, time to resharpen. If it's just dust, then it's definitely well past time to resharpen. It's kind of like using a card scraper, or one of the Diablo Red Devil scrapers that Kevin has. If you're scraping and it's just coming off with dust, you've got a dull scraper. If you're getting curls, you've got a sharp scraper. Same thing. And again, like with the sharpening of the tools, we can, at another point, if you want to talk to me about sharpening, we can talk about sharpening at a later point. But you're not sharpening with lathe tools nearly to the polish that you're sharpening your chisels and plane blades to. I think my grinding wheel, I've got a 120 grit diamond wheel and a 320 grit diamond wheel, and that's the extent that they get sharpened to. The 120 grit is for when I really want to put a burr on a piece for a scraper, or if I want to take the back off of a blade. Questions? I know I kind of threw a lot of things out there. Yeah.
What would you use a diamond tool for?
I wouldn't.
Okay.
Like this? You mean the diamond shaped? Yeah, I wouldn't use this.
What could it be used for, though?
It's intended to be used as a parting tool to go straight in to the piece and either cut something off. But I think that these are really poorly made tools, poorly designed tools for what you're asking them to be used for. I would use a straight bladed, like a flat a flat blade here, because then you can also sharpen each of the edges that put a burr on it that allow for the whole tool to get in where you want to go. Because that's another place where the tool is really going to heat up, is if it's not making room for itself. Same thing with all of the gouges. If you find that the gouge is rubbing a lot on the piece, or there's a lot of chatter, both a lot of chatter and a lot of heat, maybe you need to grind off the back heel of the tool a little bit so that that's making a lot less contact. Other questions? Cool. Well, that is 7 fundamentals of getting a good cut on a lathe.